She was a complete stranger. I'd have sworn I'd never seen her before in my life. She sat down across from me, asked me to pretend to be her husband for one dinner, and I nearly walked. Then, she pushed a folded piece of paper across the table so we could keep our story straight, and I unfolded it, and the whole room went quiet, because I knew that handwriting the way you know your own face in a mirror. It was mine. Words I'd written a lifetime ago, in my own hand, to a woman who wasn't this stranger sitting across from me. Let me back up, because a moment like that doesn't mean anything until you know the letter, and the coward who wrote it, and the 12 years he spent wishing he'd been braver. I'm Daniel Hayes. I'm 40, and I'm a bookbinder. I repair old books and I make new ones by hand, with paper and thread and glue, and I do a bit of letterpress printing on the side. It's a quiet, old-fashioned trade for a quiet, old-fashioned man, and it suits me. I spend my days with words other people wrote, making the objects that hold them last a little longer than the people who wrote them. There's one thing about my work that matters to this whole story, so I'll say it plainly. I know handwriting. I've handled thousands of letters and inscriptions and scribbled margins over the years, and I can tell you that a person's hand is as much theirs as their voice. You don't mistake it. You especially don't mistake your own. I live alone, above my bindery, and I have for a long time, and I'd made a careful peace with it. I'm not a sad man, or I didn't think I was. I'm just a man who let the great thing in his life slip past because he was too afraid to reach out and take it, and who then built a quiet, tidy, solitary existence on top of that one failure. Which brings me to Ellen and to the letter. When I was 28, I was in love with a woman named Ellen Cross. We met at the bindery. She came in with her late grandmother's Bible, the spine broken, the pages falling loose, and asked if I could save it, and I could. And by the time she came back to collect it, I'd fallen so hard I could barely work the till. Ellen was warm and clever and carried a little sadness that made you want to spend your life lightening it. She was a school teacher. She read constantly, which for a bookbinder is nearly a spiritual compatibility. And for the better part of a year we circled each other coffees, long talks, walks that always took the long way home in that agonizing, wonderful space where two people both know and neither one says. I loved her. I want to be clear about that, because my whole life turned on it. And I did what I do, I put it into words. One night I sat down and wrote her a letter. Not a text, not an email, a real letter, on good paper, in ink, because I'm the kind of man who believes some things deserve to be permanent. And I poured everything into it, every feeling I'd been too frightened to say across a year of coffees. I told her I loved her. I told her I wanted to build a life with her. In my own careful handwriting, I wrote the truest things I have ever put on paper. And then I didn't send it. I lost my nerve. It's as simple and as pathetic as that. I read it back, and a cold wave of fear went through me. What if she didn't feel the same? What if I'd misread the whole year? What if I ruined the one good thing by reaching for more? And I folded the letter and slid it inside a book on my shelf, and told myself I'd send it when I was braver. I was never braver. A few months later, Ellen's father took ill in another state, and she moved to care for him, and we said a warm, aching, entirely unspoken goodbye. She left believing I understood this far too late, that I'd never felt anything more than friendship, because I'd never once told her otherwise. The letter that would have told her stayed folded inside a book, and I let the best thing in my life walk out the door, and I spent the next 12 years knowing exactly what I was. A man who'd been a coward at the one moment that counted. And here's the part that makes the rest of this what it is. I didn't even keep the letter safe. Years later, a low stretch, maybe 4 years on, when I was trying to clear out the flat and my own history with it, I sold off a big box of books to a dealer passing through. Dozens of them. And I didn't check them carefully. I've been almost certain ever since that the letter went out with them, folded inside one of those books, sold for a few dollars to a stranger and gone. I realized it a week later and couldn't remember which book, and the dealer was long gone. So I hadn't only failed to send the most important thing I ever wrote, I'd lost it, carelessly, into the secondhand stream of the world. At the time, it felt like the universe underlining the lesson. Some things, once you're too afraid to act on them, are simply gone for good. So that was the man sitting alone at a restaurant that Friday evening, 12 years later. A bookbinder who knew handwriting the way other men know faces, who'd written the truest words of his life and never sent them and then lost them, and who'd built a solitary life on top of it and called it contentment. I'd finished a big commission and decided to treat myself to a proper dinner instead of eating over the workbench again. I had a book with me, because I always do, and I was reading and eating alone and perfectly fine when a woman crossed the room and slid into the seat across from mine. I looked up. Startled, she was around my age, dark-haired, quick-eyed, with a face working hard to look calmer than it plainly felt. She leaned across the table and said, low and fast, "I'm so sorry. I know exactly how this sounds. Be my husband for one dinner. Just play along, I'll explain everything, please. I'm not a spontaneous man. I bind books, I do the same careful thing 10,000 times." My first instinct was to tell this stranger, kindly, that she had the wrong table, and I started to. "Please," she said again, and there was something in her face that wasn't a con, something genuinely frightened. "There are people over there." A tiny flick of her eyes toward a table across the room, an older couple, another man, and I told them I was meeting my husband, and it's a long, stupid story. And I just can't be sitting here alone when they look over. 20 minutes. I know what it is to be trapped by a lie you told to protect yourself. All right, I said. 20 minutes. The relief went through her whole body. Thank you. Oh, thank you. She sat back, gathering herself, and then leaned in again. Okay, if they come over. We've been married 3 years. We met. She started digging in her bag, flustered, pulling out a folded piece of paper. I wrote some of it down earlier, our story, so I wouldn't trip over it. Here, and she pushed the folded paper across the table to me. Read it quick, before they look. And I unfolded it, and the restaurant went silent and far away, because it wasn't a story she'd jotted down. It was old paper, yellowed and soft at the creases, and the handwriting on it was mine. I don't mean similar to mine. I mean mine, the exact slant, the particular way I close a lowercase a, the little lift of the pen I make between certain letters, a hand I have looked at every day for 40 years. And the words, I knew the words. Ellen, there are things I've been meaning to say to you for the better part of a year, and I've been a coward about all of them. My letter, the letter I never sent, the letter I lost in a box of books 12 years ago, folded in a stranger's bag, in a restaurant, being handed to me by mistake as a prop. I couldn't breathe. I looked up at her, and she saw my face, and her own went white. That's not. She looked down at the paper in my hands, and then her hand flew to her mouth. Oh God, that's the wrong. I grabbed the wrong. She reached for it, then stopped herself. Daniel, how do you know my name? I said. My voice didn't work right. She'd used it. I'd never told her my name. She didn't answer. She was staring at me, staring at the letter. And I watched something break open in her face, the whole pretend to be my husband performance falling away, and underneath it someone frightened and stunned and on the edge of tears. That's your letter, she whispered. It wasn't a question. It's you. You're, oh my God, it's actually you. How do you have this? I could barely get the words out. I was holding my own 12-year-old heart in my hands in a restaurant. This is mine. I wrote this 12 years ago. How do you have it? How do you know my name? Who are you? She pressed both hands flat on the table like she needed it to stay upright. My name is Grace, she said. Grace Bennett. And I need you to understand that I did not plan for it to happen like this. I grabbed the wrong paper out of my bag. I've had that letter with me. For she stopped, took a breath, made herself slow down. There's no one over there I'm hiding from. I made that up. The husband thing. I made it up because I've been sitting across this restaurant for half an hour trying to work up the nerve to talk to you. And I couldn't figure out how to start. Because what I have to say sounds insane, and I panicked, and be my husband was the only door I could think of to walk through. Her eyes were wet. And then I reached into my bag for the notes I'd written, and I grabbed that instead. Because it's the thing I've been carrying around for 8 months. And 8 months, I said. I found it 8 months ago. She reached into the bag again, carefully this time, and drew out a book, an old cloth-bound novel, worn at the corners, and set it on the table between us. and I understood that this was the book my letter had lived inside for 12 years. I buy old books. It's a habit my grandmother gave me. We used to go round the secondhand shops together every Saturday when I was a girl. Her voice caught on that, and she pushed past it. I bought a box of them at an estate sale last spring, and I was going through them one night, and this letter fell out of this one. No envelope, no name on the outside. So I told myself I was just looking for who it belonged to, and then I started reading, and I couldn't stop. I sat there and let her go on, because I couldn't have spoken if the building were on fire. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever read," she said simply. "Whoever wrote it loved someone so much it came off the page like heat. And it was never sent, you could tell. It was folded and put away and never given to the person it was for." And she wiped at her eyes, embarrassed. I became a little obsessed. Not in a strange way. I just couldn't stand it. This much love, written down. And the person it was meant for never got to read it. I kept thinking about them, whoever wrote it, and whoever it was for, and whether they'd ever found each other, or whether this letter was the great mischance of somebody's whole life. Sitting forgotten in a book. "You could have thrown it away," I said. "You could have put it back in the book and forgotten it." "I couldn't," she said, like it was obvious. "Could you have?" I looked down at my own handwriting and had no answer to that. She'd figured out who I was the slow way, she told me, and here I have to admit that as she explained it, some part of me was braced. Because I'd already leapt somewhere in my head. She knows Ellen. She's connected to Ellen. She's come to tell me something about Ellen. I was so certain of it I almost said it out loud. But that wasn't it. And the truth was stranger and plainer. "There was no name signed," Grace said. "You never signed it. I think you meant to when you sent it. But there were details in it. It mentioned a bindery. It mentioned repairing a woman's grandmother's Bible, that was how they met. And it was written in this very particular, careful, deliberate hand, the writing of someone who cared about writing, who made the letters like they mattered." A small, wet smile. "So I went looking for a bookbinder. In this region, because the estate sale was local. And there aren't many of us left anywhere, are there? It didn't take as long as you'd think to find a Daniel Hayes with a bindery one town over." She looked down. "And then it took me 8 months to work up the nerve. Because I stood outside your shop 3 separate times and turned around every time. How do you walk up to a stranger and say, 'I found the most private thing you ever wrote, and I've been carrying it in my bag for most of a year'? You can't. So tonight I heard you sometimes ate here on a Friday. And I came, and I sat over there for half an hour. And then I panicked and grabbed the most insane excuse in the world. And then I grabbed the wrong piece of paper. And here we are." I turned the letter over in my hands. My own words, 12 years old, softened at the folds from being carried in a stranger's bag for 8 months. "I wrote this to a woman named Ellen," I said, and my voice was barely working. "I loved her, more than I've loved anyone, before or since. And I wrote all of it down, everything, and then I was too much of a coward to send it. She left thinking I never cared. And I put the letter in a book, and years later I sold the book by accident and lost it. And I've spent 12 years knowing I threw away the best thing in my life because I couldn't work up the nerve to mail a letter. I set it down on the table between us like it might break. I told myself it was gone. That's how I've lived with it. A thing you were too afraid to send is a thing you've lost, and lost things stay lost. That's been the rule." Grace was quiet a moment. Then she said, carefully, except it came back. I looked at her. "I've read a lot of old letters, Daniel, going through all those books over the years. Most of them are ordinary grocery lists. Weather, love to Aunt Margaret. This one isn't. And I don't think a thing this alive spends 12 years finding its way back into the exact hands that wrote it, just so those hands can fold it up and put it in a drawer again." She didn't push it any further than that. She just let it sit on the table next to the letter. And I understood, sitting there, that the entire architecture of my life had been built on a lie, a comfortable, terrible lie I'd told myself for 12 years. That once you're too frightened to act, the chance is gone. That a thing unsent is a thing forfeited. And here in my own hands was the physical disproof of it. In my own ink, the letter hadn't vanished. It had waited. It had traveled 12 years through hands I'll never know to come home to me. carried the last mile by a woman brave enough to do the one thing I never could: walk up to a stranger and say the frightening, true thing out loud. We stayed at that table a very long time. The older couple she'd claimed to hide from got up and left. She didn't notice. We talked the way I hadn't talked to anyone in years. And when I finally asked her the thing I'd been circling, why though? 8 months. Standing outside my shop. You could have posted it back to me and been done. She looked down at her grandmother's shop hands for a while before she answered, and what she said made her a person to me instead of a messenger. My husband died 4 years ago, she said quietly. We were young. It was fast, and the thing I couldn't get past, the thing that still wakes me up, is all the things I never said to him because I assumed we had time. Ordinary things. Enormous things. I had years to say them, and I kept thinking there'd be a better moment. And then there wasn't any moment at all. She touched the edge of the letter. So when this fell out of a book, and I read a man being that honest, that unguarded, with someone he loved even though he never sent it, even though he lost his nerve, some part of me just couldn't bear for it to have been for nothing. I needed it to reach the person it was for. I think I needed to believe it's not always too late, that the words still matter even when they're years late. I needed that for me, probably. More than for you. But that's the truth of why I couldn't let it go. And that undid me more than the letter had, because it turned the whole night from a strange coincidence into 2 people meeting at the exact place they were, each most broken. I did find Ellen. I want to tell you that part honestly, because it matters. It took a few weeks, and I did it the brave way this time. I found where she'd gone. And I learned she'd married years ago and had a family, and by every sign, a good and happy life 3 states away. I braced for a certain kind of pain, and it didn't come, or not the kind I expected. Because I sat down and I wrote her a new letter, and this time I sent it, walked it to the post office myself, and watched it go. I told her the truth, gently, that 12 years ago I'd written her a letter I was too afraid to send, that I'd loved her, that I'd been a coward, and that I wanted nothing from her now except for her to know she had been loved. Fully, and that my silence had never once been indifference. She wrote back, a kind, warm, married woman's letter in a hand I still recognized. She told me she had wondered, all those years, that she'd half known and never been sure, and that it meant more than she could say to finally know she hadn't imagined the whole thing, hadn't been foolish to feel what she'd felt. And that was all it needed to be. 2 people, 12 years late, finally allowed to stop wondering. We closed the door softly, together, from the same side. Some second chances aren't a door you walk back through. Some are just a wound you finally get to close, and closing it, it turns out, is its own kind of mercy. And Grace, who'd carried my heart back to me across 12 years and a box of secondhand books, and who was carrying a grief of her own the whole time. We didn't rush it, and I want to be honest about that. Because the version where a found letter fixes a man overnight is a lie, and there was too much real in this to cheapen it. I had 12 years of cowardice to unlearn a whole life built on the conviction that the safe thing was to never reach out, never risk, never send. That doesn't dissolve over one extraordinary dinner. And she had 4 years of her own unsaid things to make peace with. But we'd each landed, by the strangest road, in front of exactly the person who understood our particular wound, because they were the same wound, hers and mine, the words we didn't say in time. And I was not going to sit across a table from a brave, warm woman who'd spent 8 months carrying a stranger's heart because she couldn't bear for it to go undelivered, and be a coward one more time. So I told her the truth out loud, at the table, with no folded paper to hide behind. That somewhere in that long first dinner I'd started to feel something I hadn't felt in 12 years, and that it terrified me, and that being terrified was exactly the thing that had cost me my whole life once, and I wasn't paying that price twice. And Grace, who had felt the same pull and been just as frightened of it, said yes. Yes to finding out. We went slow, and we went carefully, 2 people who'd both spent a long time alone learning how to be brave. She kept the old letter, my letter to Ellen, in the cloth-bound novel she'd found it in, and it lives on our shelf now. And now and then I take it down and look at my own younger handwriting and marvel at the road it traveled to get here. Because that's the truth of it, in the end. The most important thing I ever wrote was a letter I never sent, to a woman I lost, and it spent 12 years finding its way back to me through the hands of a stranger, not to return me to the person it was written for, but to lead me, by the most unlikely road imaginable, to the person I was actually meant to find. A woman I'd never met asked me to be her husband for one dinner, and I nearly walked, until she handed me the wrong piece of paper by mistake, and I recognized my own handwriting on it, the letter I was too much of a coward to send 12 years ago. She hadn't found me by accident. She'd read the truest words I ever wrote, and, carrying a loss of her own that had taught her the same hard lesson, she couldn't bear that they'd gone undelivered, so she spent 8 months looking for the man who wrote them. I used to believe that a thing you're too afraid to send is a thing you lose forever. I don't believe that anymore. My letter took 12 years, and a box of old books, and a brave woman's stubborn heart. But it came home, and it turned out the person it finally needed to reach wasn't the woman on the envelope at all. It was me. It came back to teach the coward who wrote it how to stop folding the truth away in books, and hand it, at last, to the person sitting right across the table,